Hello and welcome to the Read to Know podcast, where the goal is to actually remember what you read. On this podcast, we go through a book one chapter at a time, and each week we actually practice remembering what we've read. So we don't just remember, but then we can actually better apply it to our life. If you want to follow along, we're currently working our way through Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This week, we'll be looking at the chapter entitled Paradigms of Interdependence, and next week, we'll look at Habit 4, which is Think Win-Win. I'm Zach Brown, and my friend Chris Yarber is joining me to help discuss and break down this book. Also, if you've been listening and following along up to this point, we're super stoked that you're here, and we'd love to hear from you. So please reach out and say hello. We are at Read to Know Pod on all platforms. Also, if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating and a review. It would help us a ton. And if you don't have Apple Podcasts, no worries. Just share this with a friend who might be interested. Anyway, thanks again for listening and enjoy the conversation.
So, Zach, you discovered something very interesting about our podcast this past week.
Yes. So I was looking at some analytics. You know, I like analytics.
Yeah.
I like looking at analytics. And so I was looking at like the stats and analytics for our podcast, and it shows you what kind of charts you land on. So like on Apple Podcasts, it'll show if you hit the self-improvement chart, like top 100 or something like that, and it'll show your position in those charts, and it'll show you kind of where you've progressed and how high you've gotten on those charts. So I was looking at that. We made it to some charts. We are on Apple Podcast charts. We've made it to number 35 in the self-improvement category.
Yes.
Did you know that?
And when you told me that, when you first told me that we hit that chart, I was like, that's awesome, because self-improvement is kind of where we saw, especially with the book we're covering.
And that's a very competitive podcast like genre.
Yes, there's a lot of content in that genre.
Yeah.
So I was honored to hear that, and I was expecting you to say in the U.S.,
Right.
of course, because podcasts are listened to in more than just the U.S., in case you're listening and live in the U.S. and didn't know that people listen to podcasts outside of the U.S.
For Apple Podcasts, these charts are different depending on what country you live in.
Yes.
And we were not on the U.S. charts. We were not on the U.S. charts. We were 35 in the self-improvement genre in Japan.
Awesome.
So apparently we may have a Japanese audience. We are trending among Japanese listeners. So honestly, if there are any Japanese listeners out there, reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you, because we want to know, what you think, and we'd love to talk.
Yes. Yeah, we would love to hear from you. Tell us what you think of the podcast, and they can email us at the Read to Know Pod, P-O-D, at gmail.com.
Yes.
Is where you can email us.
And Read to Know Pod on all other platforms, Instagram, Facebook, etc.
Right. And our website as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I thought that was a very interesting piece of information there that is worth sharing.
Yeah, that was interesting.
So
for all of those listening, whether you are in Japan or in the U.S. or in another country, because there also are other people listening in other countries as well.
Yeah.
We appreciate you listening. We've enjoyed making the first couple of different episodes. We've really enjoyed this book. And today we get into a chapter which is between Habit 3 and Habit 4. You would expect him to jump right from Habit 3 into Habit 4. Mm-hmm. This chapter is not an overview of habits 4, 5, and 6. You would expect that, but it's not. The chapter is entitled Paradigms of Interdependence. Mm-hmm. And so what we're doing, and I imagine, because in my book, we've talked about how mine on the Kindle is an infographic book. And so mine, at the beginning of every single chapter, has a circle. And in that circle, the first line says dependence, the second line says independence, and the third line says interdependence. And between the dependence and independence is habits 1, 2, and 3, because you're working your way from dependence to independence. And now that we're getting into habits 4, 5, and 6, we're working our way from independence into interdependence. So we're making that shift. And so that gives us the name of the title of this very small chapter in between habit 3 and 4.
Yeah. It kind of felt like very similar to the first chapter in this book. So similarly, how he takes the first chapter and just kind of sets up some basic ideas and thoughts that you need to have in order to better understand and apply the first 3 habits, really all the habits. But then we have another chapter right here that is just kind of like another entry level, like thoughts and ideas chapter, where we can then look at these next few habits through the lens that he's giving us in this chapter to help us better understand and apply these next few habits.
Right.
It's kind of the way that I saw it, and
Right.
it definitely seems that way. And basically, as we move to interdependence, as we move into 4, 5, and 6, we realize that now we're getting into the relationship aspect of everything.
Right.
So now the first 3 were obviously private victories. They were, as he calls it, getting dominion over yourself,
Yes.
Self-management, self-leadership. We're now working into the relationship aspect of these habits and how everything is connected in a relational way and how you connect to other people.
Yes. And he repeats time and time again in this chapter that private victories, which that's the victories that habit 1, 2, and 3 cover, is the private. It's the self-mastery, just like you said, the self-management and self-leadership. Private victory always precedes public victory. And in fact, as you get into relationships, as you build these relationships, especially in these organizations, families, marital relationships, all of those examples he gives in this chapter, he always talks about the best thing that you can bring to the table of relationship is who you are.
Yes, and basically he goes through and kind of highlights here that all these things that he's about to talk about when it comes to relationships and how to positively or negatively affect them, all of these apply to any kind of relationship that you're in, whether it's a family relationship or a work relationship or a friend relationship. All of those apply to what he's about to talk about. And all of us have our own emotional bank accounts.
Yes, which is not a term that he necessarily came up with.
Yeah.
Because I've read this before. I don't know who the original creator of this idea is, but if you haven't heard of what an emotional bank account is, imagine that every single person emotionally has a bank account. And when you're dealing with people on a daily basis or however many times you interact with them, pretty much anytime you have an interaction with them, you can either be depositing something positive into that emotional bank account of theirs, or you can be withdrawing depending on the experience. And we're going to do our best to try to remember the 6 major deposits that he talks about in this book, because he talks about 6 major emotional deposits that you can make in someone else's life, which I'm so glad that he gives us this practice, because he mentions in this chapter, before he gets into these 6 major deposits, that when Stephen has worked with major organizations, he has found that the problem is oftentimes the problem with the organization is public victories between, and these emotional bank accounts between executives and people who work right under them. So oftentimes, if there's a problem with the owner of a company and the president of a company, 2 people who work very closely together in most of those circles, there's a problem relationally that flows down through the organization.
Right.
And the same is true with a CEO and a CFO, and that relationship, goes through the entire organization. And so making these 6 major deposits is very important to the health and effectiveness of your relationships publicly, which is, of course, why they are a part of the public victories.
Right.
So the first major deposit out of these 6 is understanding the individual, which reminds me a lot of when you and I think we've mentioned Enneagrams here, maybe kind of in passing or joking about them here on the podcast, but you and I have done that test and discovered and talked about ours, and a very helpful tool to understanding your personality and some of your strengths and some of your weaknesses as well.
Right.
And in the Enneagrams, part of that is understanding and learning that not everything that is important to you is important to other people.
Right.
And that same principle can be applied here to understanding the individual. That not everything that's important to you is important to that other person, or not everything that's normal to you is normal to that other person. And so we really have to understand the individual to build a relationship with them, and then we make a positive emotional deposit.
Yeah. Basically, everyone sees and responds to the world in different ways.
Yes.
And you just kind of have to relationally look and just understand where they come from and how they think about things, how they process information, what they like, what they don't like, all those things. And basically he talks about understanding the individual. That actually is kind of a gateway and kind of helps feed the rest of these deposits that he's talking about. So this first one out of the 6 help really contribute to the rest of them. Because that's the main one. Like if you could only do one, it starts with this, and then the other ones, add on top of that. And because a lot of these next ones that we're about to talk about, they kind of flow through this idea of understanding the individual.
Yes. And which links very well with the second one, and I think he has a distinct order to this process. The second one being attending to the little things,
right?
Which I think connects to the first one, because what may be little to you, and of course he's saying that with your perspective on what is little, because he gives an example of one of his kids continuing to ask him about something to him that was very little, attending to the little things. However, as we just reviewed with the first point, what may be little to us is not little to the person that we're depositing into.
Right.
So attending to the little things is the second one.
Yes, and then the third deposit that he mentions here is then keeping commitments, and it's pretty straightforward. Obviously, if you make a commitment to something, keep it no matter what. And basically, he said there are rare occasions where, for whatever reason, he tried as hard as he could to make that commitment or something. He then, if he cannot, obviously, like, go apologize and make it right and do what you can to do. But literally, basically, he says in this section, just as much as humanly possible, don't ever break a commitment. Ever.
Yeah, right. It is it has to be one of the most major deposit that you can make, because what it helps is it helps build trust, which is foundational for all relationships. And I'm sure everyone would agree. I would rather not, especially if it's like a boss at work or a loved one, you would rather them not make a commitment than make a commitment and not be able to follow through. Because if you don't make the commitment, of course, it's not there. And like you said, do everything that you can to make that commitment, make it near impossible not to. That's so foundational to making a major deposit.
Right, exactly. And he also mentions, I think this is one of the things, like it can be a beneficial thing when you make that deposit, but it can be also, this is one that's very detrimental if you don't make that commitment. Then it'll be a big withdrawal.
Right,
is what
and that's a good point, because I didn't think about that when I was reading through this chapter. That every single major deposit could also be a major withdrawal
if you don't do it.
If we don't do it.
Yeah.
So that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's just kind of interesting how that balance plays out. And he talks about that, like he talks about it towards the end of this chapter. But if you do things like that and you repeatedly apologize for the same thing, that actually turns into a withdrawal. And he gets into that because the last one is apologizing when you make a withdrawal. Right. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's, it plays similarly to all of these, here. But then the fourth one
is clarifying expectations.
Yes. And basically when he talks about clarifying expectations is that, and I've noticed this in my own life and other relationships, that I have, that a lot of times when we are in a relationship with someone, there are a lot of things that are just kind of unsaid,
right?
And it's things that we expect, but we have never verbally said it. Right. So, and that could be in a work relationship, and that could be in a marriage, that could be in a friendship, it could be any kind of relationship where, you may think, obviously they know that this is something that I'd like or I want, or, but no one has ever come out and said it. So then, and they don't know,
right?
Because it's never been said. So they can't read you can't read minds. I can't read minds. So, and it comes down to, maybe having like honest conversations and being like, hey, if you're a boss, I do want that report on Friday every week at 10 o'clock. I could have it at Friday in the evening, but it would really just be better for me and my schedule if I had it in the morning or something like that.
Right.
You know what I mean? That kind of expectation, if you don't clarify that, if you don't say that, he may have the report in by Friday, but if he doesn't think that it's a big deal to have it at 10 o'clock versus 3 p.m., then he would never know that unless he was told.
Right, and this is where habit 1 really comes into play with these expectations, because you have to understand, if you don't communicate expectations to another person, and then they don't meet those, that's on you for not communicating those expectations.
Right.
Yet those are your expectations. You're bringing that into that relationship. And this is why mastery over self is so important before, and why it precedes the public victories, because we have to understand these expectations are our responsibility, and so we have to communicate them if we expect them to be met.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so then the 5th deposit then is
showing personal integrity.
Yeah.
Is the 5th one, which is honestly one of my favorites to read about, because integrity is not something that you talk a lot about or something that you hear.
Right.
I kind of like the word honor,
Right.
But integrity, he says, goes beyond. It includes, but it goes beyond honesty. And now, just like we talked about with the 3rd major deposit, honesty, of course, builds trust for that relationship. But really what integrity is, it's a little bit broad, but really what integrity is, it's the principle of treating everyone the same, is what integrity is.
And I liked his definition between honesty versus integrity. He said, honesty is when you shape your words to meet reality, and then integrity is shaping your reality to meet your words. Which I thought was just an interesting, correlation and interesting, definition there. But yeah, and man, is that a tough thing to do sometimes?
Oh, it is.
I think I've said that probably about everything in each of these chapters about something. But yeah, man, really being, someone who is full of integrity, who doesn't talk bad about someone behind their back, even in a joking way.
Right. And that goes for everyone, because
Yeah.
the principle is that you do that for everyone, that someone sees your life as they're looking from the outside of it. Because we're looking inside out, but they're looking outside in to us. And when people see that life played out, do they see, okay, they're treating this person just as they do me, whether it's with kindness and respect, or whether it is with keeping and making commitments and different things like that. Do they see that through your life in every single person that you have a relationship with?
Yeah.
And then the 6th one, we had a little bit of discussion about the 6th one before we started recording, because, and I would love to hear, for those who are listening or for those who are watching, if your book stated the 6th one as the law of love and the law of life, which is what mine stated it as, but yours had a different 6th major deposit.
Yeah, so you had the Kindle version and I have the physical book.
Yeah.
And on the physical book, the last deposit was just admitting and apologizing for your mistakes or for your withdrawals quickly, apologizing quickly for your withdrawals that you make in relationships. And I think that is the 6th one. That sounds more like the 6th one than what you had. I don't know if that's a typo or some kind of weird thing in the Kindle version, but
yeah, I don't know. And it is a section in your book, as we looked, it is a section that plays after the 6th one, so we will mention that. But I read it as the 6th major deposit, but it's really what you're going to talk about here.
Yeah, so this last major deposit is just and I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but when you make a withdrawal, just quickly go and be like, I'm sorry I did that. I'm sorry I didn't keep that commitment. I'm sorry that I didn't clarify expectations with you on this thing, that type of thing, and apologizing for it. But he also gave the example that you have to be careful, because if you do make that same withdrawal multiple times and you continue to apologize for it, then the apology actually becomes a withdrawal in and of itself, because it doesn't seem authentic, because you haven't changed anything about your behavior.
Right.
And so if you apologize but then keep doing that same withdrawal, it's actually going to have the opposite effect.
Right. And this apology almost, you made a withdrawal. And now that you apologize, we have to remember you still made a withdrawal, and you have to keep that in mind. You still made a withdrawal. And so total forgiveness is possible, but that memory will be there of that mistake that you made. So I think emotionally not all of that deposit goes back, but this is certainly just a deposit that is made on top of that withdrawal that you made. But you're right, making the same withdraw time after time after time and apologizing for it,
Right.
certainly can bounce back.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so then moving on to this last kind of section here, he just talks about the laws of love and the laws of life. And basically he just kind of says that, following these ideas and following these principles here, it has effect in your relationships, whether positively or negatively. And actually, if you make a deposit into someone's life, obviously you're going to reap benefits through that. And obviously you making a deposit into someone's emotional bank account is not a goal to try and get more from them,
Right.
Try to be able to make yourself benefit from that situation. That's not what it's about. It's just about living with the intention of just loving other people is really
Right.
what it comes down to. And that's
Right.
what he talks about. And actually being able to do that actually then helps other people to become better versions of themselves as well.
Yes. I thought it was a weird title at first. When I first read, that kind of caught me off guard, this section, the law of love and the law of life. And really what happens here is other people are living the law of life. And if you come and sincerely live that law of love, then you really do help them in their life. And as you said, become better people.
Yeah.
So a little bit strange title there, but the concept kind of reiterates and overarches all of these different major deposits.
Right. Yeah. And so then this is how he sets us up for the next few habits as they become more interdependent as they become more relational based. It gives us a way to look at each of these habits and a way to kind of integrate them into our lives, thinking about how we can be have a negative influence on other people, and we can make withdrawals from their emotional bank accounts,
Right.
and how doing that too many times actually leads to a depletion of the actual relationship, and it breaks down the actual relationship between two people.
Right.
And when you make positive deposits, then it can actually breed strong relationships and actually trust inside of those relationships, which is really the key component. Trust is what breeds effectiveness really in a relationship and with an interdependent job or project with.
Right. I want to say this before we open up the book and pull out a couple quotes, because although this is a small chapter, there still are some incredible quotes in here that we don't want to be overlooked just because of this overview section that we do at the beginning. But as we move into these public victories, as we move into 4, 5, and 6, of course, it's a continual thing. No one who's been listening to this podcast or reading this book, in the amount of time that you read these chapters, no one can look back at those application sections and say, I have mastered every single point. And just as he mentioned in the book before, as we get into these public victories, let's continue to form these first 3 habits to master ourselves, to look back and to remind ourselves of these private victories that we need to continue to make on a daily basis, because that's what will energize and push the public victories.
Yeah, all these things are still a work in progress as we move along through these. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
So,
you ready to bring out the book?
let's do it.
All right. All right. So we are back and we have our books in front of us, and we just want to cover some of the things that we didn't quite cover as well when we were practicing or remembering, and just touch on some favorite quotes or lines that really stuck out to us through this. So we might not cover everything in depth, but we'll cover the parts that we think need a little bit more attention, and then just our favorite lines and quotes from this chapter. So I just want to start out with actually something in the first paragraph here, just kind of a basis for what this chapter is about. And he talks about that we should remember that effective interdependence can only be built on a foundation of true independence. And we touched on that, but I just think his line there is just, it makes it very clear, that really, again, this stuff of interdependence, of relational communication and deposits into someone's emotional bank account, all of that stems from a solid foundation of independence, a solid foundation on habits 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
And he talks about that. There's no way you can he mentions this at some point in there, that you can kind of fake it. You can kind of fake, relational savvy in a sense, with other people, but eventually that breaks down.
Right.
That won't last forever. So you have to have a solid foundation of yourself, and he calls it a dominion over yourself, a self-dominion in a sense. And really that's kind of like almost like the ultimate freedom is control over yourself.
Right. Yeah. A couple paragraphs down from that, there is a quote, a little bit of a paragraph that I love to feed into what you're saying, where he says, some people say that you have to like yourself before you can like others. He says, I think that idea has merit, but if you don't know yourself, if you don't control yourself, if you don't have mastery over habits 1, 2, and 3, in other words, if you don't have mastery over yourself, it's very hard to like yourself, except in some short-term, psych-up, superficial way.
Yeah. And he continues that with real self-respect comes with dominion over self from true independence, and that's the focus of habits 1, 2, and 3. Independence is an achievement, and interdependence is a choice only independent people can make.
Right.
Unless we are willing to achieve real independence, it's foolish to try and develop human relations skills.
Which then he continues by saying, and I said this, I didn't say it exactly like he did, that the most important ingredient we put into any relationship is not what we say or what we do, but what we are.
Yeah.
The most important ingredient. That's probably my favorite quote in this whole chapter.
And that really ties into the integrity factor of the emotional deposits. And then he also talks about techniques and skills that really make a difference in human interaction are the ones that almost naturally flow from a truly independent character. I find that interesting, because there are so much. If you go to YouTube or if you look at the self-help section of the bookstore, or even podcasts, they talk about things that so you never run out of things to say in a conversation, or how to impress people at work, or like all these relational things that are very they're trying to make you look better to other people, basically. And like he said at the very beginning of this book, is that not all those things are bad necessarily, but he says that really those skills and techniques flow naturally from someone who's actually just truly independent.
Right.
Someone who has mastered habits 1, 2, and 3, really a lot of those relational things just kind of come naturally.
Right. I want to cover, just so everyone who's listening or watching understands the emotional bank account.
Yeah.
Is something I want to cover. We all know what a financial bank account is, and so it works very much the same, that we make deposits into it, we build it up. We like it when there's deposits. We don't really like it when there's withdrawals, especially with a lot of bills and stuff like that. An emotional bank account works the same way. It's a metaphor that describes, he says here, the amount of trust that's been built up in a relationship.
Right.
And as I mentioned before, he did not, I don't think he invented this, because this is talked about in marriage after marriage after marriage book. We talk about this in premarital counseling all the time, or marriage counseling that we do.
Yep.
And so this emotional bank account is a metaphor that describes the amount of trust.
So really, trust is the currency.
Yes.
And if you make a deposit, you add trust. If you make a withdrawal, you take away trust.
Right. And we have to remember that our most constant relationships, those that we see most often, like marriage, for example, require our most constant deposits. If you're not married, maybe it's a roommate, or maybe it's a friend that you see a lot, but they require the most constant deposits, and that's important to keep in mind.
That is important to remember. I mean, because you think about the people that you see most often, you're like, I just did something nice for you yesterday. That kind of thing, and sometimes, I think we all maybe think about that, you know what I mean? Like, but those are the people that you have to you have to make deposits with most often.
Right.
And it's just an interesting thing to definitely keep on the forefront of your mind. And then also, I think it's interesting. We didn't mention it earlier, but this is an example. This is an example of the P to PC balance from back in chapter 2.
Yes. In
a relational aspect, and all of these things, this whole bank account, and all these withdrawals and deposits is just it's a example of the P to PC balance, the product capability relationship.
Right. And if you're like me, I read this later on I say later on in my life, I'm 26, but I've read it later on as of now, just a couple of years ago. Yeah. And I wish I would have learned this before a lot of my relationships from those in high school and college and stuff like that. Because some people may be listening to this and some of their key relationships have kind of been in disarray.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that there really is no quick fix to this.
Yeah.
This emotional bank account, we're not talking about a quick fix to all your relationship problems,
Right.
but he says building and repairing relationships are long-term investments, and those long-term investments can start taking place today.
Yeah, there is no quick fix. That's exactly what he talks about here. And he also mentions something that I find interesting. He says when the trust account is high, communication is easy, instant, and effective.
Right.
But then when the trust account is low, it's the opposite, right? He says, what flexibility do you have when the trust account is low? You don't have any, and that's the thing. When your trust account with someone is high, like you relate to each other, you can communicate quickly and easily. There's little to no friction in the relationship.
Right.
When the trust account is low, it's the complete opposite.
Right. And some questions to ask ourselves may be, okay, how comfortable do I feel talking to this person? Or do I have any hesitation in communicating something that I need or desire from this person? And those will kind of help gauge our trust level with other people, because we can say, well, yeah, I've worked with so-and-so for a long time. Of course I trust them. But then when we discover that there may be a little bit of friction in that relationship, we may, as we begin to ask ourselves those questions, we may think, wow, maybe a lot of withdrawals have been happening that I haven't noticed. And it's easy to say that I trust someone, but it's much harder to face the reality and to ask those questions and to discover that friction.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And moving into these 6 major deposits here, I just want to pull out a couple quotes that I liked from here and kind of dig deeper into some of these. So under the first one, understanding the individual, he says here, it takes habit 2 to recognize and recommit yourself to the value of that person, and habit 3 to subordinate your schedule to that human priority. And that's kind of a very interesting idea there. And I think I mentioned this briefly when we talked about last week. One of the goals that he had as an example for like the week was fix his daughter's bike. And, like I said, that doesn't seem like a very worthwhile goal, does it? You know what I mean? But It really wasn't a goal from the standpoint of like, oh, I got to fix a bike. It was the goal of really, he was putting a deposit into that relationship. He was putting a deposit into his daughter's emotional bank account. And that's an interesting way to look at these through the lenses of habit 2 and habit 3. You then see the greater picture, the bigger picture to mundane or maybe not very interesting tasks and things that you have to do. And then habit 3 gives you the flexibility to prioritize around those things that may not seem important, but they are because they make an emotional impact in a key relationship.
Right. I also like under this emotional deposit how he begins to speak about a friend who is a college professor. And he says one day he shares with this friend, he says, one day I shared with him this principle of making what is important to the other person as important to you as the other person is to you.
Yeah.
So I just love that line.
Yep. And it's kind of an addition here to the golden rule as he talks about, but he kind of switches up the definition of the golden rule and he gives his own. And his is to understand that person deeply as an individual and the way that you would want to be understood, then to treat them in terms of that understanding. And that's basically, his version, his definition of the golden rule, but it boils down to that same thing.
Right. And then we get into the second major deposit, which was attending to the little things, which most of this is a conversation that he has between him and his son, is most of this conversation to show, as we mentioned in the first half, how this thing for his son was little to him as a father, but not to the son. And so in him attending to that, he gained some trust and made a healthy, positive deposit into his son's emotional bank account. And then the third one, which is keeping commitments, which, of course, these are kind of, self-explanatory, but he starts off by saying that keeping a commitment or a promise is a major deposit, which is really one of the only ones that he says he uses that language. It's a major deposit. Breaking one is a major withdrawal. He's very careful to point that out with this third one.
Yep, definitely important because, like I said, it's huge when it comes to that, and it destroys trust when you break a commitment like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And then fourthly, clarifying expectations. And he says in here, there's one quote I like that he says in here. He says, that's why it's so important, a couple paragraphs down from the beginning, that you come into a new situation to get all the expectations out on the table.
Yeah,
so
that's a good idea.
Right, and it's never too late to do this in a relationship.
Right, yeah.
And so he says from the start it's good, but if you've already started, it's never too late to just come out and to explain all the expectations and put them on the table.
Right.
And he says people will begin to judge each other through those expectations, which is a beautiful thing because it's been communicated, it's been set, and now they have a lens to judge and evaluate you through.
Yep.
And so it's no longer just a guessing game with people anymore, but they've laid out their expectations.
And it's funny because and I was thinking this before he mentioned it in this book, but he also at the end here he says clarifying expectations sometimes takes a great deal of courage. It seems easier to act as though differences don't exist and to hope things will work out than it is to face the differences and work together to arrive at a mutually agreeable set of expectations. And that's true. Like, how many times have you not mentioned something like that? Maybe because you feel like, it's too trivial, like it doesn't really matter, like we can get around it. It's not, because you're afraid that it just comes off as weird or or something like that, but it actually would make the relationship a lot smoother if you did. That's because he also says earlier, he says the cause of almost all relationship difficulties is rooted in conflicting or ambiguous expectations around roles and goals. So really, this is almost the number one cause of conflict in a relationship is the lack of clarifying expectations.
Right. So I would say if you walk away from this, remembering all 6 of these can be really difficult even after having a conversation. So again, that's why it's important to go back and to read and to try to remember from here on out. But if there's one that I'm going to keep in my head moving forward into these public victories habits, it's this one.
Yeah, it's definitely an important one.
Yes, and so is the 5th major deposit, which is showing personal integrity, which we said this, but integrity includes but goes beyond honesty. That honesty is telling the truth. In other words, it's conforming our words to reality.
Right.
And integrity is conforming reality to our words.
Right.
Is how he says that.
Right. And we mentioned this as well, but one of the most important ways to manifest integrity is to be loyal to those who are not present. And it's basically you treating everyone by the same set of principles.
Right.
That's what it comes down to.
Right. And then the 6th major deposit,
apologizing sincerely when you make a withdrawal. So it takes a great deal of character and strength to apologize quickly out of one's heart rather than out of pity. A person must possess himself and have a deep sense of security in fundamental principles and values in order to genuinely apologize.
Right.
Again, that doesn't sound very fun either.
No, it does not. No. Very hard to admit.
Yeah.
Take responsibility. Yeah, very difficult.
Yeah. Not fun to do, but once it's done, it makes a huge impact, a huge positive impact.
Right. And that's where the strength from those private victories comes into play, that you can accept the responsibility of your actions and then to ask for forgiveness, which is a really humbling thing to do, but needs to be done to make a major deposit. Yep,
exactly. And he also mentions again, and we kind of mentioned it, but repeated apologies interpreted repeat apologies are actually interpreted as insincere, and they make withdrawals.
Right.
And the quality of the relationship reflects it. So, again, it's important that if you do make a mistake and you do apologize, that you then don't make that same mistake again repeatedly, because the more you apologize for the same withdrawal, then the more that apology actually turns from a deposit into a withdrawal in and of itself.
Right. And as we come closer to the end of this chapter, there's one last section which is entitled The Laws of Love and the Laws of Life, which, if we want to summarize that, can be put as he puts it here when he says, when we make deposits of unconditional love, when we live the primary laws of love, we encourage others to live the primary laws of life. And then he does the reverse, and he says, when we violate the primary laws of love, when we attach strings and condition to gifts, we actually encourage others to violate primary laws of life.
Yep. And when we do work in that, we can, when we truly love others without condition, without strings, we help them feel secure and safe and validated and affirmed in their essential worth, identity, and integrity. Their natural growth process is encouraged. Right. So again, it basically says that, working through this and really treating people in love and following these and making deposits consistently, it actually brings out a better version of themselves. You help people become a better version of themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is, it's basically what he's talking about. Our circle of influence begins to expand. Not because we're trying necessarily to control people, but it's that same principle of the more that we focus on our circle of influence and not our circle of concern, our circle of influence actually begins to grow.
Yes.
Not when we focus on the circle of concern.
Right. And he touches on that a little bit in one section that surprised me. He brought up towards the end, which is the P problems are PC opportunities, which he says in there, every P problem is a PC opportunity. It's a chance to build the emotional bank accounts that significantly affect independent production, because independence is where we are moving.
Yeah. And again, it just comes back to the point of these small, insignificant things. They actually have a greater and bigger purpose if you see it through that lens.
Yes.
Basically is what it comes down to.
Right. And I love how he says that many interactions change from transactional to transformational, and strong bonds, he says, of love and trust are created as children, since the value parents give to their problems and to them as individuals. So this emotional bank account, these deposits that we make have such a huge impact as we move into these public victories.
Yep. And this is the basis, the foundation for moving into interdependence, basically. Right. So... yeah, I mean, that pretty much covers it. Next week, we'll talk about habit 4, which is think win-win.
I'm looking forward to seeing that. He always has interesting titles for these habits. You don't really know what to expect when you dive into them. So I'm
excited because we are basically now we are halfway through this book.
Woo!
We are halfway through, so it's been a lot of fun so far, and I've enjoyed it. So, and I'm excited to continue.
All right.
Through this. So, all right, I'll see you then.